I don't know if I would want to kind of launch and have to manage a community like Sissy Fight today.
Bit of flame war. That might be the most 90s thing.
And when I look back at all of GameLab's games, I think that Diner Dash, which was the most successful, was maybe the hardest as well.
By Professor Eric Zimmerman. He has worked on such games such as Diner Dash, which I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with, Sissy Fight, and most recently, he is the author of the book The Rules We Break. And he also has a fascination with the game of Monopoly, which I'm really excited to learn more about. And we also have Lewis Ward joining us today. He's just as fascinated, if not more than me. So, Lewis, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
But before we give it to you, Lewis, Eric, thank you so much for joining me. Anything you want to say about yourself?
I'm just really happy to be here. I am a game designer. I've worked in the game industry since the 1990s, and I sometime after that I became a professor at NYU at the Game Center, which is the Department of Game Design at Tisch School of the Arts, and yeah, I make a lot of games. I'm a cheap date for game design. I'll make any kind of game. I make video games. I make tabletop games, card games, and board games, museum installations that are large scale interactive things. So I really like inventing new forms of play and writing about game design and teaching game design.
I am very excited to break all that down and more. Lewis, you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, great to join you again, Greg. Yeah, and I'm thrilled to have Eric Zimmerman here, Professor Zimmerman, I might say.
It just
Because
call me Eric, please. No one calls me
I'm Eric.
Professor Zimmerman. Thank you.
I
I
enjoyed
appreciate
his.
it, though.
Yeah, well, some people love the title, and it is, it is a valuable thing. But again, I was a Games for Change. I wrote something about it at IDC.com about it. We kind of cornered Eric. Yes, that's true there. Just because I thought his talk was super interesting. So we'll get to a few questions about that, but. And also, his book is really good. He was kind enough to send me a copy. I can't recommend it enough. What I especially liked about Eric's background, and he crosses the boundary between the IRL games like board games, yes, but also the rules of society and the unwritten rules of
Mm.
society. And to me, that's also super fascinating when you start connecting the dots between how video games are designed. It's almost like a negative space where you make these rules, and the play emerges from the negative space designers create. But anyway, super interesting read. I'm only partway through it, but again, happy to be here and excited to get on with it.
Lewis is breaking into the meat of the conversation right in the set, and I love
Can't
it.
help
But
myself.
I think what Lewis said really fascinates me as well. I've learned to love game design, and I'm seeing more and more people talk about board games and physical games. And
Mm.
the more I look at design, I see it can almost fit into every aspect of your life, depending on how you want to look at the rules that you create. We're going to dig into that, but I've learned to love career development and learning how people do this. And one of the main hats you're wearing now, whether you like the title or not, is professor at NYU Game Center at the Tisch School of Arts. I'm curious, how do you fall into a role like that? Did you ever see yourself going in that direction, or how did that happen?
Well, I guess we could trace it a few different ways. I studied art originally, so my undergrad degree is in painting, fine art degree, BFA, and I got an MFA in art and technology. Although I'm not a technologist, I collaborate with programmers a lot. You know how they say that just enough martial arts to really get your ass kicked? That's exactly how much programming I know, like, just enough to, like, really get into trouble. But anyway, but my background is in fine arts, and, I come from a family of academics. So my parents were both university professors, actually professors of art education, at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, where I grew up. So, but I never thought I would be a professor. I always said, okay, at first I wanted to be an artist. Then right after graduate school, I entered the game industry and I realized, oh, this is like another really interesting way to make culture. And I just always said, look, I'm a designer. I want to work. I want to make things. But I also started teaching right when I was out of graduate school at ITP, the Interactive Telecommunications Program, which is also in Tisch School of the Arts. It's sort of their very famous digital media and design program, which is around from the 70s. So it's been around a long time. And Frank Lance and I, another New York City-based game designer, started teaching game design there way in like the early 1990s. And I just as an adjunct, I was just teaching a class, once a week, coming into the university and teaching. And I guess over the years I just kept on teaching. So I in those days, game design wasn't a thing that you could study. Games had already been around for decades. Atari had come out when I was a kid, and arcade games. I grew up with arcade games and Apple II Plus and all this stuff. So it's not that games and video games were new, but no one had really written books about how to design them or how to teach them. So Frank Lance and I were really kind of exploring that whole field. I remember going to the NYU library and typing games into the university computer, and we were just like running around like grabbing books. What the hell are students going to read in our class? But in figuring out how to teach game design, we really ended up figuring out what this field was. So in a funny way, although I kept on working full time in the industry, I had my own studio that I formed with Peter Lee for a little while, for about 10 years. GameLab that made Diner Dash, among other games. I was always teaching. So I was teaching as an adjunct at NYU, places like MIT, School of Visual Arts, Parsons School of Design. Um, and I have to say, for as a designer, teaching really became part of my practice. And it became part of how I understood what games were and how they function. I don't believe in teaching like I have all this knowledge and I'm like injecting it into my students. I teach like I'm in there learning with them and we're all figuring this thing out together. And but as the person leading that process and having to like structure things and name things and figure things out, that it's really taught me so much as a game designer. And that actually led to the first book I wrote, which was with Katie Salen, called Rules of Play. And that was published by MIT Press like way back in 2004. But that started with my teaching with Frank Lance. Like the structure of the book is based on the classes that we taught. And that's a standard textbook for game design. So a lot of students know that book, Rules of Play. But anyway, so that's how I ended up here. Then eventually, GameLab closed and I was freelancing around, and they were starting up a new program at NYU for game design. And they asked me to come and help design the curriculum. Frank Lance was the director. So this guy I had, been making games with on and off during my whole career. He was the director. There were some famous folks like Catherine Isbister and Jesper Juhl, who, if you're in the game studies arena, you might recognize those names. But the four of us designed the curriculum and started the program. And I've been here ever since. At this point, at the NYU Game Center, I'm the dinosaur here. I'm the one who's still around from the very beginning. Frank is retired, and Jesper and Catherine have moved on. But I'm really happy to still be here and teaching games and shaping this program. It's a very highly regarded program in game design, but we're all still figuring it out. We're still constantly changing the curriculum, trying things out, seeing what works and doesn't work. Anyway, sorry
Playing
for the
with the rules,
long-winded answer to your question.
playing with the rules of how to design a curriculum.
Totally. I
Um,
mean, teaching is so much like game design. You set up a structure, which are like the rules, right? The policies, the assignments, even whether you're going to grade or not grade, who's working with who in what way, the constraints on the projects they're doing, and then they play with that, right? Like it's the same thing. Like you set up a space, and then they inhabit that space, and they might follow the rules or bend and break the rules. And your hope, just like a game, and as a game designer, my hope is always to see players doing things I never anticipated. That is the sweetest pleasure for me of game design. And as a teacher, it's really the same thing.
yeah.
Like seeing your students do things you didn't anticipate.
That's awesome. Yeah, it makes sense. I think that was the line in your book. And I would say, as an analyst, I knew just enough about how to make a game to be a little bit dangerous myself. Like I never wrote code. Actually, I did Apple II code in the 19 freaking 80s. I did design a game, but mostly kludging together other scraps from other games into something like Joust or whatever. But
Do you notice that game design changes throughout the years based on where we are in technology, or does it kind of also kind of go in this loop where we're coming back to the past and looking at what we've learned from the past?
Well, I guess, can I say yes and no? I think
Yeah.
that I mean, I teach game design, the fundamentals of design, off the computer. So I teach, because I'm not a programmer, I'm not teaching the software development courses. I'm teaching the classes, the really like fundamentals of game design for our BFA and MFA students. And and this was also what Frank and I did at NYU originally. And for me, it's almost like when you look at like I don't know, us and a tree and a chimpanzee, like we share like some like large percentage of our chromosomes, and genetic makeup and everything. And there's a level at which a game is a game is a game. Like what it means to design meaningful choices, training things like systems thinking or collaboration, the rapid prototyping and iteration process, all of these kind of essential tools for making games and concepts. uh there you know First of all, I think there's a lot of overlap between tabletop and analog games and sports and physical games and digital and video games. And also there's it's easier to teach in a sense. You can quickly whip up a card game prototype, a minute after you have an idea, not like a week or a month after you have an idea if it's a video game. But in it in so on one level, I think a game is a game is a game, and there's just so the fundamentals really do move across media. On the other hand, of course, whenever you're doing a specific project, you really need to look at the affordances of the platform and the way that your audience is using that, right? Like, using like this is really different interactivity than like the computer that I'm looking at right now that has a mouse and a keyboard. So of course, as technology and platforms evolve, then those are an intimate part of the thinking from the very beginning of any project. So yeah, I think that you kind of need to um, think about it, from both sides of that coin. But definitely, I mean, now things like um, I'll give you a really good example. It kind of in an unexpected way. Like when I started my career, there wasn't digital distribution of games, right? In the 1990s, that sort of happened. Sort of, I don't know, the late 90s when the World Wide Web was sort of was becoming something that was about to change everybody's lives. And yeah, people used to have to buy a video game off a shelf, which was like made in a factory and pressed on a disc and then shipped across the world like a physical commodity. And then publishers were fighting for that shelf space, and they'd never, thousands of games would come out every year. And there was this whole thing about how to reach consumers. But digital distribution completely changed the game industry, right? I mean, not only was there no, a different kind of fighting for shelf space, but an actual game creator in an app store, the Steam store, can now make a game directly for players. So that, for me, that's a really good example of how technology um, completely changed the kinds of games that were made, who's making games, the scale of games, for example, revenue models, and if new kinds of people are making games, and that led to the rise of indie games, right? And which has really changed the cultural status of what video games are. Technology is also super important.
I would like to go to one of your early games. You mentioned Diner Dash, but
Hmm.
Sissy Fight, which is just a
Okay.
funny name that I love. I haven't played that one, but I think it was built on Shockwave or Flash or something. This was like 2000, and
Yes.
it was even a multiplayer game. And
Yes.
I believe this was probably around the time you were starting to teach or an early experiment before Diner Dash, if I got my chronology right. But having grown up in the 90s myself, playing a lot of games, having played, some of those early Atari things and the PlayStation One, all that. Um, you know, I can I know how hard it was to do an online multiplayer game.
Yeah.
And I know, and I saw it was mentioned in the rules you break. You had a little bit of a vignette of what that game is like, but both in terms of I guess how the game came about. You designed a certain set of rules, and then
Mm.
I guess secondly, how did it actually work on the internet, right? Because it sounds like it had
Yeah.
at least it found a niche audience, and maybe you can still play it even today. But I just wanted to double click on one of your early games because it sounded technically super difficult to actually pull off back then.
Right. Yeah, that's funny that that the technical aspect of that game was actually something quite innovative. It was a browser-based game, and we launched it in 1999, so we probably started developing it, a year or two before that. I worked with Word.com, which was at the time a New York City-based sort of content company. This was like the first wave of Silicon Alley. companies, .com companies, and they were just a great content site, really quirky, really uh, uh, really interesting aesthetically and culturally. But they wanted to make a game, and I've been put in touch with people working there. So I was the lead designer and worked with a team to develop this. Um, we It started actually as a paper prototype. So we wanted to make a social game about social interaction. And the very first version, we were playing with post-it notes around a table. Um, and that's how we developed the kind of core logic. But it's really a game where everybody inputs their turn, and then everyone is playing a little girl on a playground. So everyone starts off with 10 self-esteem points. And the goal of the game is to reduce the self-esteem of the other girls on the playground. And there can be one winner or two winners, sometimes no winners. And so it's a very satirical game about childhood. It's not for children,
Okay.
and it uses a kind of a game theory or prisoner's dilemma structure. Um, that for the game designers, that's a simultaneous outcome, simultaneous move contingent outcome structure where everybody inputs their turn and then they're all revealed at the same time, and the success of what I did depends on what everyone else did. So for example, if if uh uh Lewis, if Greg just teases you by himself, nothing happens. But if I also select tease and I also select you as a target, then you're teased by two people, and then your self-esteem is going to go down. So it was all about this kind of negotiation and then backstabbing and trying to be the last one standing, but also having to work with the other girls there. So it's a very much a kind of like Lord of the Flies sort of vibe.
Okay.
Um, and but the
Sounds a little bit
technology.
like Among Us. I don't know if that's a fair analogy,
Yeah,
but
oh yeah, I mean, it's Among Us in the sense that, yeah, I mean, preceding that game by a couple decades, but yes, it wasn't about a hidden identity. So you
okay.
but each move that you made was in secret and then revealed. It's close to the board game Diplomacy, if
Okay.
you know that sort of classic game where
Heard of it nothing.
everyone writes down their moves, and it's like, well, I'm invading France. Well, if it's one versus one, it doesn't succeed. But
Okay.
if Germany is also helping England invade France, then it's two versus one, and then you can move your unit in there. So it's that kind of structure that, if diplomacy really breeds backstabbing and a lot of arguments and tension. So Sissy Fight was really meant to playfully um comment on and kind of capitalize on like what happens online when you have like ranting and bad behavior or sort of playfully transgressive behavior. But technically, yeah, it was real-time chat in a browser. So all of this was facilitated by communication. So every girl has a little word bubble, and there was sort of a constant six-way conversation going. And I can't tell you anything about technically how it was made. Ranjit Bhatnagar was the lead programmer. He ended up working at GameLab, the studio that I co-founded with Peter Lee a few years later. But Ranjit was a technical whiz, and he somehow was squeezing all this functionality out of the browsers. And I remember that was kind of a big deal. And I think maybe it was Shockwave
Yeah.
was the original tool.
Pre-Flash or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
And I do have to say that we Ranjit and Naomi Clark, who is now the chair of the NYU Game Center, who was also a designer and producer on the project, the three of us ran a Kickstarter a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, to sort of like raise a little bit of money to recode the game for contemporary browsers. So Sissy Fight 2000 is still up online. It's not, it's a little bit of a deserted playground these days, but you can still go on with friends and play a game. So I'm very happy about
It
that.
sounds like you could build like a battle royale out of something like that and just
Yeah.
cause mayhem online of people trying to like bully other people for
they
lack of
probably
better
Yeah.
don't need
words.
help with the trolling though. They're probably
Oh
doing
Yeah,
that
yeah, a
themselves.
lot
it's
of
funny. Yeah, I mean, there was definitely with people. We used to call it flame wars, right? When people would like on message boards and stuff. So it's true. I don't know now. It is a different era now. We were kind of playfully sort of prodding people into negative behavior. Now all of it is so much worse than that. I don't know. I don't know if I would want to kind of launch and have to manage a community like Sissy Fight today, but that it was definitely a game of its era. It's still a fun game to play. I mean, it's a very classic, simple game, um, that is really about the social dynamics between the players.
I love how you called it a flame war. That might be the most 90s thing that was ever said on my podcast so
Totally.
far today, and
Yeah.
I
All
love it.
right. Well, you're Lewis. I blame Lewis. He's dragging us
Yeah.
back to my early
Bring it back
career.
to '90s, baby.
Yeah.
Well,
Love it.
let's jump up a few years, right, and talk about Diner Dash. I think that was probably one of your first breakout hits as a game designer.
Hmm.
It was developed by GameLab, published by Play First in 2004, and I can tell
Right.
you it's one of the things that I told my wife. I was like, "You ever play this?" And her eyes lit up. Like, yes, I played that game. It's probably one of
Mm.
the first games she's played that I'm talking to someone on the podcast about. It's a mobile variant still around, so it seems like strategy and time management kind of it stuck with people, and people still
Right.
love those types of games. And when you look back at it, what's the biggest thing you think you got right? And was there something you think you got wrong when you took a look at that game?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, first I should say that I definitely helped come up with the whole concept and with that game, but Nick Fortuno was the lead designer at GameLab. So I don't want to steal his credit, but like all games, it was very much a team effort in terms of, Peter Lee had a lot of input on that game, my co-founder of the company, and a lot of us worked on it. Yeah, it's true, Greg, that the game definitely, I mean, it did not invent the sort of time management kind of gameplay, but it really did like establish it, and it really stuck. My company only did the original Diner Dash. So just the very first game. All of the other we ended up selling it to the publisher, selling the IP to the publisher. All of the other sequels and mobile versions, those are all kind of derivatives made by other people. So I don't even know what happened, but I like who actually made those other versions. I would say what we got right. Um, here's one thing that we kind of accidentally got right. We were at GameLab, and generally in my career, I don't make hardcore games. I play a real, like games of all kinds, like but in my career, I've mostly tried to make games for people that I hate the term casual players for casual games. What musician says I make casual music, But anyway, let's call it like a more broad audience, right? So I love making games for people that wouldn't normally play games. For example, and Diner Dash was also meant to be that, right? It was meant to be very accessible. The theme was not whatever shooting aliens or killing dragons. It's like running a cafe, and there's a whole story about a character that sort of like trying to get her business going. So um I think one of the funny things that we got right is actually that game, if you get into it, gets really hard. The original game is really, really difficult. And when I look back at all of GameLab's games, I think that Diner Dash, which was the most successful, was maybe the hardest as well, which is really interesting, right? Which maybe would cause you to like rethink this whole idea about, well, a mass market game has to be easy, right? That you kind of have to spoon feed it to the, chew the food before for them, So I think that was an interesting lesson from Diner Dash.
Well, I think
um
Donkey Kong, right, is that they just keep shortening the time, right? So that if you get up to you probably saw the Donkey Kong documentary, whatever, King of Kong, where when you get super, super high, they just keep shortening the time so that your margin of error of do jumps and follow their
right.
exact pattern has to get more and more split second. So anyway, I sorry to interrupt you, but I'm almost thinking that with the level of difficulty rising, and I don't know exactly how, what changed there to make it if it was really that same split second thing, but it would allow for eventually only a tiny fraction of players to
Right.
actually keep mastering it. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we also there's a lot of levels to our game, so um and the levels just get harder and harder, more customers to fulfill, and yeah, a little bit stricter on how long they're going to wait before they start getting impatient and leave the restaurant, so you won't get points for them.
Right.
So yeah, that definitely, like, yeah, we also had a curve, like a curve that starts sort of
Okay.
gentle and goes up like that. So um in terms of what we got wrong with Diner Dash, I don't know, maybe GameLab should have held on to that IP. We had a weird deal with the publisher, and I think probably we made a right decision. I will say one funny thing about that game, which is that I love the character and the narrative and everything, but in a funny way, it's very if I think about some of the kind of critical work, the museum kind of work I've done these days, it's very like uncritical about capitalism. It's just kind of like, oh, make a restaurant, make more money, invest more money. It definitely falls into this kind of you know, let's call it ideology of sort of growth of games where it's like all you're trying to do is, you know, get more money so you can build more things, and then you can get more customers and do more things and more things, and it's a little bit like a uh I know that that's no one probably reads the game like that, but now I look at it and I'm like, oh, it's a little cringy for me, like it's sort of a love letter to capitalism or something. But maybe that's just me. I've grown up, right, since
Well,
then.
at the end, you could have had the exit screen where they're like retire on a beach somewhere. You just didn't do that part.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Although again, I don't know if that's maybe
They would stop playing though. So the IP owner would not want that. Are there one or two you've done IRL stuff? You've done obviously video games. You've done board games and stuff. Are there one or two design principles that you've seen consistently in your work, which I suppose says something about you as a designer, or they're really depends on the game, and you're do a wide variety of things, and there aren't certain themes or certain structures in the design principles that you find yourself playing with more than others.
I would say the process of design is what I mostly teach, right? So
Okay.
yes, there's concepts and things like that. So I don't know if I'm stretching your use of the term principle, but I think that the core concept that I teach students, which is just based on my own experience as a game designer, is this idea of iterative design.
Mhm.
That you build a game as quickly as possible, and then you base your design decisions on your experience of that. So you build something, then you play test it,
Right.
right? You play test it initially, maybe start getting other people to play test it, and then you analyze what worked, what didn't work, what might we change for next time. You make those changes, and then you have a new build
Right.
which you can then play test, and
Right.
then you analyze the play test, and then this cycle, that is the iterative cycle where you're making successive versions of the game, and you try and get there as quickly as possible. That's the main thing that I teach, how to get there. And with a game like Sissy Fight, I mentioned that we started with a paper prototype because there were technical problems that we started solving off to the side, but we also had gameplay problems, which were, okay, how do we get this kind of vibe of kind of playful but mean and fun social interaction? It turns out that if you're doing a turn-based game, um, writing your messages down and sending them to someone who's like quickly trying to calculate and then revealing them the way the game would, that works pretty well just as a basic um, as a basic version of the logic of the game. So that was the process. Okay, how do we quickly get to a prototype? You have to strategize about that. Um, and I think that that way of thinking is something that you find in a lot of design fields. But I will say that when I meet people who are other kinds of designers, right? Like architects or product designers, industrial designers, who I feel they're sort of my spiritual sisters and brothers, but they often have like a very long research phase. They'll find out, which is great. It's like, what's our problem? Who are we addressing? Who's our audience? What problems are we solving? Let's analyze their kitchens or their lifestyles. How are we going to fit into that? And then at the end of this process, you end up with a prototype. And what I my thinking as a game designer is that you make the prototype at the beginning, right? And you do those other things too. You also start learning about your audience, but the actual making is threaded throughout. It's just a different emphasis. It's a more experimental um process.
Sounds like Google. You might have worked for Google early on. They get it out there, break it, and fix it.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I want to be compared with Google, but yes, I guess it's similar to that. Yeah, rapid prototyping and then learning organically um uh from that process, like growing a plant,
Yeah.
like you want to get it out of the ground and then kind of seeing how it grows and fostering its growth. So that's one principle that I would say runs throughout my work, to answer your question, from the museum installations I've done to board games to video games. Just getting to a prototype very, very early.
It's
Yeah, that's great.
cool to hear you say that, right? And it kind of brings me back to the idea of digital distribution, right? You talk about,
Mm,
we classify that as feedback, right? You want to get feedback, and when you're
right.
creating Sissy Fight, right? Digital distribution wasn't really quite there yet. So what was the quickest way to do it? Let's print up some post-it notes,
Right.
throw them around, start playing, and now you have digital distribution. And it's funny, there was a report that came out actually today from Newzoo that
Ooh,
talked about Roblox and how the best use of Roblox for a lot of designers is to quickly prototype something and put
I've
it out
heard
there.
that
And if it
too.
works, you
Yeah.
build something bigger. But this is a quick way to throw a bunch of slop together, for lack of better words,
Right.
and see what people want to play and get that
Yeah,
feedback.
no, it's funny, but someone was just asking me, "Do you guys teach Roblox in your school?" And I'm like, "Roblox?" They said, "Yeah, a lot of schools are like using it as rapid prototyping tool, or like a make quickly throwing together a 3D world, because I guess it does have, like, it's 3D, it's got game mechanics built in, it's got, lots of assets you can use, and it has custom scripting as well if you want to start going
Mhm.
deeper. So
Yeah.
it's interesting as a platform that way.
Yeah, just I kind of love it how no matter what, when and where you look at it, right? Feedback is a core design principle
Co-
people need to look at. Like if you're,
Completely.
yeah,
Completely. And this is why, I feel like, as a designer, um, the human skills are so important, right? So in thinking about feedback, I think part of what you end up training yourself as a game designer, really any kind of designer, is to observe people, and observing them all the time, but especially when they're playing your game. Like, like it's funny, you just train yourself, you can immediately look at people playing your game, whether it's a video game or a tabletop game, and you just the body language immediately tells you the energy. Are they engaged, are they not engaged, are they like paying attention when other people are playing or not? And then you learn to, like, uh try and sculpt those rhythms of the game. Okay, there's too much dead time. What are they? How can I sort of get them involved when it's not their turn? Or, what can I give them something to do or think about? So, for example, right? And it's, yeah. So for me, that's also a kind of feedback, right? Like, just looking at what people are doing and how they're engaging with the game. So that's also part of it. You're, of course, you're doing other things too. You're like testing the balance of the game. Is this character overpowered? Like, are they getting into the story? Are they using the interface correctly? Like, there's 100 different things that you could be playtesting. um but they all have to do with that kind of feedback.
Can I offer another analogy you're probably not
Yeah.
going to like? Facebook
Oh,
is
yeah.
accused of having addictive apps, right? And in some senses, when you talk about the design of seeing when
Mm.
they're down, when they're disengaged, whatever, in some ways you could be accused of designing for addiction. And I guess is that fair, or it just came to mind when you were describing the
Yeah,
process of
I think,
optimizing?
I mean, all right, let's open this can of worms, shall we? There's definitely things that are kind of dark design patterns, right? Where that are used in games and apps, where you're really trying to hook players. And, for example, oh, you can't go any farther until you pay us more money or recruit more friends into the game, or, we're going to have you do microtransactions that kind of build and build and build in order to kind of keep your leaderboard status where it is. So, um, I think that and there's plenty of examples of games, like, I mean, gambling games, right? I mean, the gambling addiction is something that, is known as well. But of course, humans get addicted to all kinds of things that often are good. You can also be addicted to exercise, or reading, or sex, things that are normally like wonderful in, human activities that everyone should be doing, right? So anything can be done to excess. And I think, as a game designer, it's especially important that you are conscious and aware that part of what you're doing is playing with the pleasure and desire of your audience, right? Just like a filmmaker, when you're like using emotions, and sweeping them along. I think that there's no right or wrong. you know uh Frank Lance has said that, who I've mentioned before, and he's an amazing book called The Beauty of Games. One of his points is that um, when you play a game, it's like you are able to be self-conscious about your own thought process, right? And like if visual art makes you aware of looking, playing games makes you aware of your own thinking, right? And so there's a sense in which diving into your own sense of desire, what's drawing me in, what's attracting me, like what's making me want to play this game again, that is part of, I think, the interesting reflective aspect of games, right? It sort of puts you in contact with your own sense of desire in this weird way where you're sort of, it's both pulling you along, but then you're also able to kind of see it in operation. And I think that's why there is a sort of a wonderful pleasure in, okay, one more game. I'm just going to play one more hand of poker, or I want to, okay, one more round of Tetris, or on my phone, or whatever it is. But that there's also sort of like a fine line between that and addiction, especially if you are sort of tricking players right out of their money, for example. So I guess all I can say is that this is why game design is not just about learning about how systems work and feedback loops, or even design processes, or technical approaches to programming games. It's also about understanding people and culture and ethics, right? So as creators of these kind of digital spaces and media, it's part of what we teach our game designers at NYU, right? So I guess I would say, like, there is an ethical dimension to game design. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong. I think there have been game designers that argued that, like, grinding in online role playing games is unethical. You're just giving the players busy work, right? It's not meaningful. I think it's so awesome that there's debates like that going on, right? So that's what needs to happen. Um, and so, yeah, so I think, Lewis, you're totally right that uh, a lot of these techniques can be used and are used to kind of like rope people in and basically take money out of their pocket, and I don't think that it's yeah, I would, that makes me really uncomfortable as a game designer. I guess that's all I can say.
That's well said.
One of the things I've learned to start loving, and I need to do more research on, is dopamine.
Hmm,
Games can figure a way to trigger that so well, and some of them will abuse it. Right? You have games
right.
like Monopoly Go, which do a really good job at triggering dopamine, but there's not much of a game behind it. And then you have games like Balatro, which is a poker game, which I think triggers a lot of dopamine, but you don't actually need to pay or anything, right? And
Right.
how as a designer can you balance that to make it more approachable for players? That you said it great. How do I get that one last game that itches? You know what? One more hand of poker is not going to hurt me.
What a game like Balatro does is it creates, like, almost like it creates, let's think of it as like wheels within wheels, right? Little loops of feedback and pleasure. So it's like, okay, buying a new pack and opening it up, right? Oh, that's a little unexpected dramatic moment. And then, okay, making little decisions, which cards do I buy, how do I go? Then I'm in a match and I'm like, okay, it's a slightly larger loop. I'm making a bunch of decisions. Each of those decisions is meaningful, and there's an outcome to that, right? And then there's larger loops, which is like, oh, I'm actually moving through these blinds and levels and stages. And so all these things are sort of constantly intertwined. And then there's like the whole game. But then a whole game is also there's bigger loops too, which have to do with unlocking cards, unlocking difficulty levels and decks. And so um, I think that that kind of sort of intertwining someone's um, sense of pleasure within these kind of loops of feedback, right? That are not always positive. Sometimes they're painful. I love it how the Joker makes fun of you in just this cruel way when you lose in Balatro. So, um, but and again, I'm not a psychologist. I haven't done research on this, so this is just my kind of intuition. And I think that every games all do it differently. So there's not one way. But Balatro is a really good example for me of, and I think of games like Pokemon or Neopets back in the day. Like, they also had this kind of like lots of little repeating mechanics that sort of slowly get you more points or build you up over time. Roguelikes, RPGs, there's many games that use these kinds of structures. But that kind of wheels within wheels, where there's like little moments and then those add up to bigger ones and bigger ones and bigger ones and bigger ones. It's really an interesting way to to um to get players hooked on your game. Um, Games are about meaning, right? Games are about like uh doing things that are meaningful. All culture is about that. Interacting with culture, buying a comic book and sharing it with your friends or whatever it is, seeing a movie, ranting about it online. Um, so in games, you participate in the meaning, and it's literally like I'm choosing this card over this card for my Balatro deck for my next Joker. And then the meaning of that action plays out over and over and over again because you go all through all these rounds, right? So it's almost like if meaning is like flavor, then Balatro gives you just keeps on giving you mouthfuls of delicious meaning, right? Because you're making choices and those choices add up and they kind of slowly add up in a way that is legible to you. You understand it, you can see it. It's like you're building the car as you're driving it, and like as you're making improvements you're like enjoying driving it even more and more. And I think that's a kind of like looping sort of pattern that ends up making a game like that really compelling. As you can tell, I've been playing a lot of Balatro recently,
It's
but
amazing.
it's
I,
a good
you know,
example.
I love the way you talk about it, and I'm really curious because this is great for indies, right? Indie developers. Balatro was made by one person, and I love the way you describe the loops. There's so many loops going on Balatro. I think it was made by Local Thunk. I think that was his name, right?
Mhm.
Like, do you think he purposely knew these were all loops, or did he just happen to fall into it once it was all the pieces were put together? He realized, oh, there's loops here. Like, it's hard to
Well,
imagine he thought of all these going in, but it's also hard to imagine he didn't.
Well, I mean, games are not made like you don't design them and then just build them, right? Like think about the prototyping and iteration, the paper version of Sissy Fight before the digital version. And actually in between we had a text only online version while we were still prototyping it. But anyway, so Balatro evolved like all games from a little prototype, like a little plant. And
Mhm.
so it seems in the end like, oh, of course it had to be this way, but of course it could have grown in different ways. I also think Balatro is really standing on the shoulders of lots of other interesting games and designs, right? So this idea of Balatro is kind of like what we would call a roguelike, right? It's a game. Roguelikes are types of games where you are um, uh, moving through a space and you're somehow like uh leveling yourself up, your abilities and powers in a very customizable way, in a very modular way. And like roguelikes, it has permadeath, right? If you fail once, it's over, right? So that's also gives a real edge to the decisions that you make, because if you make bad decisions or even if you get unlucky, and you didn't hedge against that luck enough, then your game is over immediately, right? So it's also building standing on the shoulders of deck building games, right? So starting with games like Magic the Gathering, that by Richard Garfield, that helped invent collectible card games, and games like Dominion that turned deck building like within the game itself, and then lots of digital games like Hearthstone, et cetera, that are digital versions of these games. So it's also pulling upon that and saying, um, that I have a deck of cards and I'm kind of sculpting and customizing this deck as I go. And the really brilliant thing about Balatro is that that's not sitting on top of some invented combat system of fantasy dragons and casting fireballs. Uh, it's sitting on top of poker, right? Which kind of everybody knows. So that's kind of the brilliant thing, which is that the on ramp into the game, which has these very sophisticated roguelike and deck building mechanics, is sitting on a game that everybody knows. And I think that is such a brilliant concept. And I think that those so I guess what I'm trying to say, Greg, is that those elements together, like this mass market game of poker that everyone knows, but then when you start adding roguelike and deck building, you kind of end up in this space where Balatro ended up. And of course, there's brilliant design going on and lots of great little tiny decisions that add up to a really successful game. But like I think from the beginning it was this kind of interesting combination of these genres. Like, okay, what if you could customize your poker deck as you go? What would that be like? And it's such a cool, interesting idea.
Yeah, I think we've seen the merging of certain genres that work out really well, and it gets
Mhm.
people enticing because you don't have to learn a whole new mechanic. And
Right.
when we start talking about your new book, The Rules We Break, right? You're kind of teaching design concepts on a fun, hands-on way. And
Mhm.
as you're talking about games, I can tell you're a true gamer. I mean, right? Like, how did you decide to go upon with that approach to game design?
Um, well, I think that from the very beginning of my teaching, I did, project-based teaching, which is like give the students assignments and their projects, and you might give them a constraint, give them a theme or a mechanic that helps shape it. Um, but I also was really influenced by Stone LeBrandy. Stone LeBrandy is a game designer that worked at Electronic Arts for many years. I worked on the SimCity series, for example. I believe he's still working for Riot now. He's made board games and video games, but Stone gave this lecture at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco many years ago. I think it was called Designing Games for Game Designers, where he just shared his class that he's teaching. And he's like, here's how I do this, and and I have an exercise about, probability where it's this great exercise that's actually I have a version of it in the rules we break called die versus die, where first two players just roll a die against each other. And okay, there's a 50% chance of winning, but you plot it on a 6x6 grid, all the different outcomes, right? And then he's like, okay, now design a die. What? Like, oh, okay, well, the numbers have to add up to 21, just like a normal die. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6. I think it's 21. And you can only put whole positive numbers on there, but design a die to beat another player. And then suddenly you're like, oh, interesting. And then he says, okay, but how can we see which die would beat another die? Well, you can use that a same 6x6 grid. It's just and then plot, the numbers of each die. It's not 1 2 3 4 5 6 versus 1 2 3 4 5 6. It might be 0 0 0 3 5 12 versus, someone else's die. Oh, my die will beat your die 2/3 of the time. So that's just one example from Stone LeBrandy's exercises, but it was like, it's not an assignment. It's not go and design a game, but it's using games to teach ideas and principles that are all relevant for design. And it was really inspiring to me. And I had been doing some things like that, but I think that he really was doing such creative work with designing these exercises and activities that give players a really focused understanding of something, in this case, probability. And I have to say, this is probability not from a lecture, but from doing something. And some students like learning passively with a lecture, but I find that more students like learning in a visual way, in a social way, in a kinesthetic way. So you're literally rolling dice, physical things. You're putting tiles on this grid of win and loss. It's like you're making probability tactile. It's such a powerful way to learn about learning and probability. So in a sense, the rules we break came out of after that, like modify, really like coming up with all of these exercises for teaching. And that's what's in this book. So a lot of them, that exercise actually is in the book, my sort of modified version of Stone LeBrandy's die versus die. I give him full credit in the book. But other things where here's a game that's slightly broken, or let's modify tic-tac-toe, list the rules, what happens when we start changing rules to the play. Um, and the idea, thank you for bringing up the book, by the way. And I just want to say the one thing about all of these exercises, which teach things like that we've mentioned before: systems thinking, collaboration, communication, the iterative process, designing, observing humans. They teach all these things. I don't think they're just relevant for game people. So the book is not just to teach professional game designers. I feel that they're teaching essential 21st century literacies, right? Which are the 4 C's of collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity, right? That they're they're getting at the heart of anybody doing creative work or technical work, organizational work. You need to understand how systems work. You need to understand how rules result in certain kinds of behaviors, or how to experiment and prototype a new project or system to see how it's working. So my hope would be that game design is kind of like an essential sort of human literacy, like we think of math or reading or music. And that's kind of what this book is pointing at. So sorry, I'm getting very excited. You can see
No, no, no. Yeah, and
I
it's
really,
like you often learn by doing, right? Like I did a lot
yeah,
of XR research over the past 5 years, and instead of seeing an instructor teach you something about making a airplane better, whatever it is, when you're in a headset in 3D, moving the actual, part of the engine around, one of the benefits that we've seen in the survey research was like reducing errors. It didn't necessarily, it wasn't better than doing it in person,
Mm,
but doing it virtually was cheaper, faster, and it would
right,
like save you time. And, there were other advantages to it. But basically, hands on learning, generally speaking, I think does work a lot better. And so, and again, you've obviously thought a lot about game design. And so you're almost playing with the idea of how you teach game design in the book, is what it
right.
sounds like.
Yeah, yeah, very, very, very much so. I think that it's, it's I use games and play to teach design. And I design for me is a very, very broad, human endeavor. So and applicable to a lot of different fields and disciplines.
I know you've looked into the history of Monopoly. You're obviously a student of the history of games, which is awesome. We talked about Monopoly Go briefly, but I don't really need to get into that and why it's successful. But certainly, Monopoly is an iconic game. And I know you're part of a documentary that looked at the origins of Monopoly. So I thought I'd open the floor to you to just say, why is Monopoly iconic? And, I know there's some irony in the history of what the game has since
Right.
become, but why don't I give you a few minutes to talk about what you love most about Monopoly, and what do you think is the most maybe misunderstood part of where it came from?
Well, yeah, Monopoly is interesting. I think it's because I was interviewed on a podcast, 99% Invisible, about Monopoly. Then that's why the documentary people contacted me. I mean, it's. I'm not like a history scholar. There are folks here at the Game Center that are more like that. A lot of what I know about Monopoly I learned from Jesse Fuchs, who's another professor here. But the ironic thing about Monopoly is that it was designed by Lizzie McGee in the kind of early 20th century. Um, and it was originally called the Landlord's Game. And it was designed as a kind of, actually a serious game, like an educational game about, uh, certain kinds of tax structures, and to sort of show what was wrong, and unfair with the sort of kind of existing way that landlords were taxing their tenants. So the game itself, though, was really innovative, because you have to think about that game at that time. Most games were like basically just roll and move, right? They were like these sort of Victorian games. That there were of course games like chess and Parcheesi were around as kind of classics, but her game were like you moved around, there was money, you paid things, there was a system, different cards. Her game is very, very close to the final version of Monopoly. Of course, there's some small changes, but there's many, many details that are very, very similar to Monopoly. What the scandal of and so anyway, just to say that Lizzie McGee was this incredibly interesting, um, woman and figure and intellectual and creative person in her day. And Monopoly is actually a really innovative game. Like it did help sort of usher in a lot of things that we now take for granted in contemporary board game design. So Lizzie McGee is first of all a kind of unheralded hero of contemporary game design. But the ironic thing is that Parker Brothers, and this has been, documented in films, there's books about it, basically stole, um, Monopoly, copied Monopoly. Charles Darrow is, credited with inventing it, but it's really kind of a classic case of, uh, unfair capitalistic practices. And in many ways, the irony is not just that Lizzie McGee has been kind of robbed of her authorship, but Monopoly has gone on to become such a global, iconic game, as you correctly said, Lewis, that, it's in many ways now the icon of the thing that it was originally meant to critique, right? So if the Landlord's Game was really about trying to have us question and be critical about these structures of capitalism that lead to unfairness between those in power and those not in power, now it's just a talk about a love letter to capitalism. I mean, Monopoly is like, just an unabashed, like, let's just celebrate greed and bankrupting each other. And it's really, uh I don't know. It's like the symbol of capitalism, right? This kind of like playful idea of competition. And then the other thing about it is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a bad game, right? Like it's not easy to critique Monopoly. it's kind of it's too long. It goes on forever. It's, like, it has player elimination, so it's like, oh, you bankrupted halfway through the game. Sorry, you just have to watch us play. It's a huge amount of luck. So it's like, okay, we're playing, and basically it comes down to, did I land on the properties that I could buy, or that I where I have to pay you or not. So it's also, it's kind of a deliciously bad game at the same time, but it's still so popular, right? I mean, the pop culture is not logical, right? Culture is not logical. It's not like, oh, only great games become the classics. Monopoly is a classic, and yeah, it has a lot of problems. But anyway, so there's multiple layers there. But I think for me, the most bitter irony is just that, yeah, that this game, which was invented by this brilliant woman, just became like the most like ironic parody of the thing that the game that was stolen was trying to critique in the first place. So,
Yeah.
Monopoly.
There's a Batman Begins quote that I always use, and I always love it. Could always make sense. Is either you die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain, and it seems like that's what Monopoly has
Yeah,
done. Is it became its own worst enemy,
that's
and
really
Parker
true.
Brothers loves it. But
Yeah, it's really true.
Breaking the rules, right? So the book is about the rules we break.
Mm,
But having read the first 30 pages or so, you also talk about that we are suspending our disbelief and choosing to voluntarily exist within those set of rules
mhm,
when we play. And that, yes, there are some games that you can, when you become an adult, play with the rules, maybe subvert the rules. And if you all agree to do it, maybe you can create something new that becomes interesting.
right.
But I guess, going back to the premise of the book, if players are allowed, and thinking about real world capitalism, if you become the monopolist, the game is over. Um, but when you break the rules, or players are allowed to break the rules of your game, the game is over, right? I mean, the game ends if that suspension of disbelief turns into somebody who can subvert the rules in a way that just makes them the winner. So I guess I'm interested about the limits of the rules we break,
Right.
because if you are allowed to break the rules of tic-tac-toe and do three around the edge or whatever it is, the game is also over. And so I guess I'm
Right.
wondering about the constraints on the rules and the importance of rules in the construct of games of all
Right.
kinds.
It's actually a really, really deep and profound question that you're dropping at the end of the conversation. So, that we could have spent the whole hour talking about this, but
I
I'll
saved the
try
best
and
for last.
yeah, I'll try and answer. I think that what's so interesting about this idea of games as systems and breaking and bending rules is that there's lots of ways that we can think about it, right? So it's true that, okay, if hacking into the server is breaking a rule and bringing down the game for everyone, then yeah, that's not necessarily like this positive, wonderful, creative example of breaking rules. But there's other ways of thinking about systems and breaking and bending them as well. One person that comes to mind for me is Bernie DeKoven. So Bernie DeKoven was a wonderful designer and a mentor of mine, who has since passed away. But he was one of the founders of the New Games movement, that brought us those books, New Games and More New Games, in the 1970s. And Bernie's book, called The Well Played Game: A Player's Philosophy, is an amazing book, written in the 70s, so prescient for our time today. The basic idea of that book is that what he calls the well played game is a game where everybody together who's playing acknowledges that we can change the rules of the game in order to make it a better game for everyone. So let's take tic tac toe for example. So you said, yes, if I just decide, oh, I can, draw X's around the edge, or I can like erase what you did and draw mine. Well, yeah, maybe that's not breaking rule a good way. But let's say you're playing with a kid, and they just started out and they realize you're about to win, and then you say, you know what, do you want to take your rule back? You want to take your move back? Yeah, let's see, or helping them out, right? So that's like bending a rule, but in a way that makes it better for both of you. Or let's say you're playing with someone and you're both pretty good at tic tac toe, and you're like, how do we make this better or more fun? Well, then maybe then drawing, a fourth row of squares around actually suddenly turns this kind of boring game into something that you both are enjoying. In which case, your exact example of drawing more X's, like an extra ring, would be a positive thing, right? So this was Bernie's idea, which is rethinking of the notion that games are these fixed sets of rules, and instead they're more like a social contract. And there's so many beautiful things about this idea. For example, it blurs the distinction between players and designers, so that as players we're not sort of just beholden to what our what we're handed to by designers, but we're kind of given games and we sort of can play with them as they want. And there's so many wonderful examples even in video games of things like interesting mods and, I don't know, cultures of speed running and machinima, people like making their own versions of games, or doing interesting and unexpected things with them. um, and I also think that this whole set of ideas of breaking the rules can apply to things outside of games too, right? Like, what if, for example, we thought of democracy as a kind of system, right, of rules? And what would it mean for us to think about democracy as a design problem where um, we don't have to take things kind of as they're given, but we can think about how we might redesign it to fix some of these problems in our creaky 200-year-old, badly patched uh, system of government here in the United States, which we can see now every day is being gamed in ways that are maybe not in line with the spirit of the original design. So
Agreed.
anyway,
Agreed.
so it's a really big and profound kind of set of ideas
Yeah.
around this idea
Well,
of breaking the rules.
that's I totally agree. Completely fascinating, and really does get into, again, system design and things like that, which we could have spent the whole hour on, but I know we're running short of time. I maybe have one more question, Greg, but I don't know if you have one more. Otherwise,
No, I just wanted to touch on the one thing because you just said it again. And it's watching people play your game and how they play your game, and I think that's
Mhm.
why it's super important. As you were talking about the rules, right? I'm thinking back to Monopoly, and sometimes
Mm.
people say, "Hey, free parking, you get the money," or "We're not playing that." Or when you
Right,
play Uno, do we keep picking cards until you go? Right? Like
very much so.
these are rules. We call them house rules, right? And I
Right,
think, right, as long as it's not cheating it, but then you can start to say, how far can I push my house rules until I
right,
can kind of game the system?
right.
well,
That's
I think everybody has to agree to them, and the problem is when somebody doesn't have to agree to it, and they're allowed to do something nobody else is allowed to do. That, I believe, violates the spirit of the
right,
social contract, or
right.
the hermetically sealed bubble, even if you choose to change it.
Right, and that's true for any social gathering. If you're sharing a pizza with friends and someone just grabs half the pizza for themselves, you're like, "Hold on a second, what are you doing?" And they're like, "Well, I'm hungry, but there's five of us here. We each get a piece and a half, right?"
Home
So,
field
so
advantage.
that's games are just like games are a wonderful space in part because they are these kind of imaginative narrative situations that are a little bit separate usually from everyday life. They're actually a good place for us to practice those things and learn about those things.
My last question was about games for change. Again, I really appreciated your talk there, and we cornered you afterwards, partly because I
Mhm.
thought it was so cool. Um, I guess two quick things, if I can. One is that there was a focus on serious games there where they are trying to teach something, but in many ways, the demos that I saw, at least, some of them were rather rigid in their rules. They didn't let you
Mm.
play with the rules. They were kind of straight ahead
Right,
narratives where
right.
they had a point and they kind of led you by the nose to
Hmm.
experience the point they're trying to teach you about being nice to other people, whatever it is. And I thought your talk kind of cut against the grain of that. So that's one thing: is what do you make of serious games, and a critique of a positive critique, because games for
Right.
change has its heart in the right place in many ways. The other one was I thought of Marshall McLuhan's "The Medium is the Message," and I think in
Mm.
your book you talk about the ludic century, which I think it means games. Maybe I didn't go look up exactly what ludic means, but I think you were implying that the strength of games is not the same strengths of the medium, right? The technology, the means of conveying information, and the message can be separated. And a linear thing like TV or a book or a podcast, are you're on this linear path and you experience it that way. But games don't have to be that way, right? In other words, the strength of that medium
Mm.
can be quite different from the linear stuff that we all grew up with. So
Right.
if I can do a two-headed question, it's, what do you make of serious games? And then B, do you agree that what is the if the medium if you agree with Marshall McLuhan that the medium is the message, how you say something is important is what you're actually saying, the
Mm.
content. If you
Mm.
agree with that in the context of video games, what is the strength of video games? What is
Right.
what are they
Right.
what is the good use of those systems and so forth?
Right. So that's the I can try and weave those two things together. You two are just hammering me with these great questions. You're really making me think early in the morning today. Um,
Or
so
coffee.
yeah, exactly. That's why I got it handy. So okay, first of all, yeah, I'm definitely the let's say the loyal opposition for Games for Change, right? So I love Games for Change. I've been a booster of their work for, from the very beginning of the organization and participate in their conferences. And I do work in the, often educational kind of work. So um I really want to support what they're doing, but I also want to be a critic, right? I agree with you, Lewis, that a lot of times we see these kind of games where we're like, well, like what is actually happening here, right? How could this be better? Is this actually innovative? I mean, it might be innovative because it's a game, but is it actually innovative in terms of how it's teaching and what it's teaching? So I that was what my talk was about. Is like, okay, how can we go deeper or make this better? Um, in order to improve what we're trying to do with games and impact, right? Whether for education or activism or what have you. Oftentimes we see these approaches that are kind of like either it's propaganda, I'm broadcasting a message at you, or I'm trying to inject information in you. It's about skill and drill, or it's behavior change, and I'm like it's just trying to train me like a rat in a cage. So all of these are kind of like very shallow notions of what people are and how thinking works and how learning can work. To switch to the other part of your question, about the medium of the message, I haven't actually thought about McLuhan specifically, but if I were going to think about it right now, I would say that for me as a game designer, I like to think about experiences that only games can make, right? For example, if I want to tell a story with a game, I don't want to think, how can this story be as good as a theater or as good as a novel or a film? I want to think, what is a story that could only be told through a game, that leverages the unique capabilities of games, for example, that they're interactive, for example, that they're dynamic systems, right? Um, in order to tell a kind of, maybe it ends up being a new kind of story, right? So that we're not trying to go toe to toe with cinema and end up with some kind of weird watered down film that's a little bit interactive, but instead something that's capitalizing on the characteristics of games. And in that sense, if we think about the medium as the message, these dynamic participatory aspects of games, how can we leverage those for learning, right? So that's kind of what I was about. How can we leverage the systemic and interactive aspects of games? The ludic century idea that you mentioned is ludic being the Latin word for play. That's all it means. But my point was that in the 21st century, um, we've seen this shift in art, media, entertainment, um, culture, driven in part by the rise of digital technologies, right? So um, uh, the in the 20th century, I think, for example, the moving image was a very dominant form of culture, right? It was a lot of our advertising, government propaganda, personal stories, pop culture, big cultural mythologies were spun out in film and video, television, and later online at the end of the 20th century. But that the moving image is still about this kind of like a sequence of images, right? But what's happened with digital technology is that that notion of just kind of linear media is sort of like becoming displaced, right? So now video is like, we can capture it, we can remix it, we can have AI making it, we watch it online or stream it, then we're chatting with our friends about it, we're looking at reviews and clips and all these things. So it's no longer this kind of immersive experience sitting in a theater and watching a film from beginning to end. And in fact, all of our media, I think, are turning that way. They're becoming more systemic, modular, interactive, because of these networks of digital information. The fact that the ways that we work and learn, like everything that happened to make this podcast happen, right? That we've been communicating over email. We're looking at a computer right now that's recording us for this podcast thing, that then it's going to be later distributed through different kinds of social media. So that's the ludic century idea. And the connection to games, and why I call that play, is because this idea of media as modular, systemic, interactive, games are the one ancient form of human culture, right? Tens of thousands of years ago, maybe 10,000, at least 10,000 years ago, people in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Africa were playing ancient table games, Mancala, Royal Game of uh, Go, Parcheesi, these wonderful ancient games. And games have always been little systems of inputs and outputs, just in this modular, customizable way, right? Games are weirdly, remarkably like chess and Go and Parcheesi. They are weirdly contemporary. They feel like little like memory addressing machines, right? Like they're weirdly computational systems. So games in a sense are the human medium that has always had a kind of connection to where we are now in the 20th century. And that's why I think there's such an interesting model for us for thinking about all these things. That's why I think, for example, teaching these game design exercises are relevant in terms of literacy for such a wide range of things. This is why I think games are interesting in terms of teaching, right? But not just injecting people with information, but leveraging these interactive computational aspects of them. So anyway, I hope,
Showing how to fish, but teaching people to fish,
yeah,
maybe.
exactly, the
Yeah,
hands-on stuff that we've been talking about. So
yeah, yeah.
anyway, I hope I tried to tie
That's
all of these
awesome.
things
No,
together.
that's deep. It was very deep, Greg. So, and
I
Professor,
love
yes.
I love hearing about Mancala and just not even thinking about how old it actually is, and it makes sense.
Hmm.
But before we do wrap today, if Lewis and I are in your class and you had to say, hey, if you're interested in game design and you got to play one board game and it can't be Monopoly, what would be? There we go. This is the
Oh,
toughest question of them all. You know.
what's one board game that I would assign to play? That's really tough. I guess it depends on oh, there's so many interesting board games that are coming to mind. Some of them are like Go, that are just like beautiful mathematical things. Some are contemporary board games like Root, which I think just are using this incredible melange of mechanics that also in a funny way is making a sort of political point. But okay, if I were to say one game, this might be a weird pick, but I think I would say like a game like Dungeons and Dragons, like a
Mhm.
tabletop role playing game, because I think that for a few reasons. One thing is that Dungeons and Dragons does so much. It does engage with kind of systems, dice rolling, simulation, but it's also the opposite of that. It's also like improvisational acting and storytelling and world building, right? And I also think that Dungeons and Dragons is maybe the most influential game on contemporary video games. That Dungeons and Dragons, things like characters, player characters, NPCs that have hit points and classes and levels, experience points that you go up, and gold and skills and abilities, and like all of these things. D&D did not invent them all, but it really brought them all together in a way that it still resonates today. So in terms of like learning about, like, D&D does so much, right? So it's both training all these different kinds of creative skills, and then also such a great history lesson too. So that might be my pick.
I love it, D&D. And for those of you who are maybe afraid to take that first step into D&D, I heard ChatGPT is actually a great partner to play D&D with to kind of
Wow.
help you get through kind of if you have any of that
Wow,
stage fright
interesting.
or
That
anything
that's
like
an I
that.
haven't heard that one, but that makes sense.
Yeah. So, Professor Eric Zimmerman, this has been such a cool conversation. Before we go, let us know anything you want and also where we can find you.
Well, my website is ericzimmerman.com. I'm at the NYU Game Center, which you can find online. And, we have a bachelor's and a master's program. We also, if you're living in the New York City area, we have um, a range of public events that happen regularly. So definitely come, and we have a wonderful lineup of speakers at gamecenter.nyu.edu.
And that's super cool. We'll have links to all of Eric's stuff as long as the stuff going on at NYU. Lewis, let us know a little bit about you and where we can find you.
Yeah, I mean, right now, mostly on LinkedIn. Again, contributing here as as my time and schedule permit. But yeah, I'm still interested in doing more research on the video games market and kind of the XR stuff like I've been doing. So hopefully, I'll have something to share in the next few months about where I'm going to land. But Professor, that was awesome. Really great to get your insights on some of these topics we addressed. And so, again, thanks very much for making the time today.
Ooh, great conversation with you two. So much fun.